Welcome everybody to another Village Torah session mini-series that I like to call 3 Highlights, where I'm your host, Rabbi Drew, and with our summer rabbinic fellow, Emily Dana, we each share 3 highlights from the Torah portion, and hopefully you find them interesting as well. So, Emily, in this week's Torah portion of Devarim, we're kicking off a whole new book, right? Last week we finished off the book of Numbers, Sefer Bamidbar. We are now moving on to the book of Deuteronomy, and we also get a Torah portion that starts, which is Devarim, which is also the very first Torah portion. So, Emily, what are your 3 highlights for this week's Torah portion?
So my first highlight is kind of a cheat because it's technically from the Haftarah, which is from Isaiah, but it's Isaiah 1:3, which is one of my favorite verses in the Torah, which is learn to do good, devote yourselves to justice, aid the wronged, uphold the rights of the orphan, and defend the cause of the widow, because it reminds us to take care of the people who are the most vulnerable in our society and make sure that they're okay. So that's my first highlight.
Nice. All right. That's a curveball taking from the Haftarah. I think that is a first in this series. I believe it is.
I think so, yeah.
Unless some historian of Village Torah decides to find and tell us that there's been a previous Haftarah mentioned, but I think we're making Village Torah history here with the first mention of a Haftarah highlight. So that's great. All right.
My other highlight of the portion is the reaffirming of the covenant. So this is the covenant that was made with Abraham way back in Genesis, when God said to Abraham, your descendants shall be as numerous as the stars.
That's in the first chapter, right?
It is, I believe, in the first chapter.
Yeah, it's right there. Early on, really setting the tone, saying things have changed. We have really grown and become numerous, yeah.
And so that's reaffirmed in Deuteronomy 1, 10, and 11, which is sort of a reminder to the Israelite people that, like, hey, we still have this covenant with God, so we got to keep going, even though we've been in the desert for, I guess, 40 years at this point, because the book of Deuteronomy is the end of the desert.
Right, that there's hope. There's hope.
Mm-hmm. There is hope, and there's hope for the promised land and hope for a lifelong covenant with God that doesn't involve wandering in the desert for another 40 years.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. All right, 2 down, 1 to go, Emily. What's next?
My last one is the fact that the encounters that the Israelites have with the Ammonites and the Moabites are peaceful.
I was surprised as you.
So in the past, as you might remember from previous conversations about the Torah portion, the Israelites and both of those peoples have had a lot of fighting between them. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of arguing and a lot of shooting things at one another. So it's very surprising in this portion, in Devarim, that they're told by God to be peaceful towards each other because they are your kin or your brothers and sisters.
They're children of Lot, so they're Lot's descendants.
Yes.
Right.
And that makes them part of somewhat the Abrahamic family tree.
Right. And for those who remember, the beginnings of both of these nations was found in chapter 19 in the book of Genesis. Just a couple of nights, a lot of wine. So that's how Ammon and Moab were created. But that's their kin basically. They're part of the larger kin, family structure. But in the book of Numbers, it wasn't so pleasant, right? Those interactions.
No,
it's almost like I had to do a double take. Did I misread what was going on in the book of Numbers? It's a different. It got smoothed over, right?
Yeah, the tone's a little bit different here.
I'm putting it pleasantly. I mean, it's actually a stark contrast to what we see even just a few weeks ago in the various Torah portions.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So those are my 3 highlights.
All right, 3 highlights from Emily. You're probably wondering, Rabbi Drew, what about you? So here are my 3. Number 1, water. Okay, so just 3, 4, 5 weeks ago, a number of weeks ago, water was it totally dominated the Torah portion. You couldn't not think about water. It kept popping up over and over. And it really was a huge issue because they didn't have water. And that really was the literally contentious issue that popped up. But it wasn't for nothing. I mean, the Torah portion does state there was no water, so it was not a made up or or otherwise a fiction of the Israelites' minds. It really was. And water is not an optional thing for
Absolutely
living
not.
creatures, human or otherwise. So that was literally something that people's lives depended upon. So over and throughout that Torah portion. Now, some of the things that occurred in that Torah portion, and picking up on Emily's third and final piece, which was we also get to talk about these various nations. Hey, can you let us pass through? We'll pay for your water. We're not just going to, be like invasive species, as it were, or locusts even, just coming through and devouring without any recompense. No, we will pay you. So actually, specifically in this week's Torah portion, in chapter 2, verse 6, they said, hey, we offered to buy water to drink when we passed through Esau's descendants' territory. And subsequently in verse 28 in chapter 2, they asked the king of Heshbon to pass, and they said, look, we'll pay for water. And that's it. That's all water gets mentioned in this summary. But as Emily mentioned, a lot of the contentious, as they were bumping up against these different nations to pass through their territory, they asked for water. And I got to thinking, why is it really is sidelined here? It's just, it really is not that much of an issue. And I wonder if for Moses, that he has a really fraught relationship with water, and not just because he was born in Egypt and he led a nation through the desert, a place that is not known for its bountiful water. I think there's a lot going on there. Yes, Moses has a really interesting relationship with water. It saved him, right? Saved him in the Nile, and Pharaoh's daughter saved him, and he didn't actually do the first two plagues because they were water related, right? Aaron did those plagues because he had a special relationship with water. And then when we get to what these two verses are reflecting back from the book of Numbers, where it was all this water stuff, there's a really big thing that he totally left out about the Mei Merivah incident, the waters of contention incident, in which he strikes the rock instead of hitting it, and God says, that's it, you don't get to go into the land of Israel. So in a way, it's almost as if he's changing the way he's talking about water, because it's a really sensitive topic for him, and also the reason that he's not even making it into the land of Israel. So I think the conversation about water and drinking that water is he really minimizes it, which I find super fascinating. That's highlight number one. Highlight number two, we get this really fascinating character of Og, king of Bashan, which he's a starring role in chapter 3. He does get mentioned in the book of Numbers, yes. He's there, and he gets killed, and it's almost the opposite of water. We get more mentions of Og, king of Bashan in this third chapter than we see pretty much throughout the book of Numbers. And he gets mentioned a whole bunch in the first 12 verses of the third chapter. Here's one. So the obvious thing that's, I think, super duper really curious and weird and fascinating is in verse 11 in chapter 3. It specifically mentions the dimensions of his bed. That it says, Og, king of Bashan, had an iron bed, and not just that, it was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Now, a cubit, if we can say maybe roughly 1.5 feet, maybe even up to 2 feet is a cubit, so that means that's massive. I mean, even that's a 6 foot wide bed and over 12, probably 13.5 feet long of a bed. Now, I think really, I don't know if that's an exaggeration, how do they even know? Why does anybody care? Really, ultimately, it's about this guy is a massive guy, huge. But the other thing that shocks me is what's not mentioned. It simply says they were able to defeat Og, king of Bashan. They were able to kill him. I'm wondering, why was there no description or other depiction of a scene or maybe a particular person facing off against him? Who was the person who was able to slay Og, king of Bashan? I
don't know, do we?
Not at all mentioned. It's just sort of a collective killing. I don't know if they had to gang up on him. Here's a contrast, okay? I know this is much later, but here's a contrast. A massive figure. Who? Goliath. So Goliath is a massive figure, and we see literally a one-to-one standoff, and David ultimately wins.
Yes.
So that is a later biblical image of specifically a face-off involving sort of a normally sized person and a much more massively sized person.
Yep.
So we could have seen a scene like that being depicted, and here no one gets credited for taking down Og, king of Bashan. I'm shocked by that. That would have made for some really colorful storytelling, or even, what's the scene in which this whole battle took place, and he gets killed. I mean, there's so much other dramatics around Og, king of Bashan. He just sort of collectively gets killed, and he's just swept under the dead king rug of the Israelites. I don't know. It struck me as being, it was a really great opportunity for really great narrative there. Okay. 2 down, 1 to go. Here we go. My third and final highlight is in chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. And this is about this sort of not wiping out, or finishing off of a particular generation amongst the Jews. And the language is Kol Hador Anshe HaMilchama, the entire generation of the warring men. So that there was, and apparently it took 38 years from start to finish, that this whole entire generation, they were in the desert, they clearly needed to go to battle, they were a roving nation, and they definitely were incredibly vulnerable. They had no fortifications behind which they could defend themselves, so they certainly needed to be able to defend themselves. They had Anshe HaMilchama, battling men, but they needed apparently to be killed off. Or not killed off, I'm sorry. They needed to, they don't live forever. They
needed to die out.
They needed to die out. That is a much pleasanter term for sure. What's really fascinating is it also specifies that God had promised that this would happen.
Yes.
Right? Almost reflecting back to what Emily mentioned in the first chapter, that they became as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands of the sea. There's just so many of them. God promised that. And we get a reverberation of this later on in the second chapter, that God promised that this entire generation also, these warring men, would be finished off. So, and just as another little piece, it says that God made them uncomfortable. That God sort of, they just couldn't still be around. They couldn't still be alive. So God was also, sure, being a warrior is not exactly necessarily a guarantee a long lifespan. There are a lot of risks, as you can imagine, for someone going into battle, especially sort of more of a melee style battling where you have swords or spears. It's not you can easily press buttons and kill someone. No, you're in close quarters combat. So that is not necessarily ensure a long lifespan, and yet God still has a hand in that. It's not as if they just kill themselves out. God seems to have a hand in sort of pushing. It's unclear exactly what that is from chapter 2 here, but I found that also that little detail fascinating, in addition to God having promised that.
Yes.
So at least in Moses' telling, God has a hand in that piece of it. So for me, those are 3 key highlights from this week's Torah portion. So do you have any thoughts on them?
I think it's interesting. I forgot that they had already been told that they were going to die out, and that the comparison to the covenant, which is there's going to be many of them, versus this generation sort of has to die out, presumably because of the golden calf, which happened way back when. But you also get a little bit of a tempering of that story in Deuteronomy as well. As opposed to the fire and fury of the earlier, for lack of a better word, of the earlier books, you have a lot more of a tempered, he's just making them uncomfortable, as opposed to Korah and swallowing them into the earth.
Right. Also, one thing I find fascinating is I don't know that I've ever, in the book of Numbers, we ever talk about it as a door Anshe Milchama, that it's the entire generation is characterized by warring or battling men, or people, if we want to. I don't know. Maybe I don't know if in biblical times women,
I don't think women.
I don't think they dressed in battle armaments, but so let's just assume it was an all-male army. That's a fail. That's a fair assumption, I think.
Yeah.
So, but it's an interesting way to characterize that generation.
Yes.
as opposed to saying the generation that departed Egypt, which I think would be a default description of that generation, and yet Moses here uses the language of Dor Anshe Milchama, generation of warring men. So I think that was for me, that was a strange language, but certainly interesting.
Yeah, definitely interesting.
Thank you so much for watching this week's Village Tour, and again, a special presentation of the 3 highlights with our Summer Rabbinic Fellow, Emily Dana, who is our Jewish Foundation Fellow, Rabbinic Fellow. Also, I want to mention that Jewish life and programs at Cedar Village are made possible by the support from the Jewish Home of Cincinnati, such as this presentation. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.